If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Senate Joint Resolution 39 has become a captivating spectacle within the Missouri General Assembly, and the amendment's sponsor is making a case why it should be in Missouri's Constitution. Senator Bob Onder of Lake St. Louis joins us on another edition of Politically Speaking.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I think that is fair to
As I
say.
hands to kiss and babies to shake. But
I think my record speaks for itself.
That's a really good question.
Hello and welcome to the Politically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Jason Rosenbaum, a reporter with St. Louis Public Radio. Joining me in studios in St. Louis is
colleague Joe Mannies.
And through the magic of radio, our guest in Jefferson City, Missouri, we have as our special guest today
Bob Onder,
a state senator, a Republican from Lake St. Louis, his second time on the show, so we appreciate you coming back. Before we get into the issues, just remind our listeners what your district in St. Charles County encompasses.
I represent the western half of St. Charles County. That's the 2nd Senatorial District. I myself live in Lake St. Louis, but basically some of St. Peter's, all of O'Fallon, Wentzville, Lake St. Louis, Defiance, New Melle, and so on, all the way out to Forestdale at the county line.
And you are the only St. Charles County senator at the moment because after Tom Dempsey left the Senate, the governor did not call a special election.
That's correct. I'm now the senior senator from St. Charles County, even though I am of the lowest seniority of any member in the Missouri Senate.
What an accomplishment.
That's
what an
right.
accomplishment. So let's get straight into issues. We have a lot to talk about. The thing that I think has captivated the Capitol over the last few weeks is SJR 39, a constitutional amendment that would legally shield businesses that refuse services to same-sex couples. It would also prevent any action being taken against any religious organization that refuses same-sex marriages. Joe, you want to explain a little bit more?
Yeah, well, you're one of the chief sponsors and one of the chief advocates, so we thought it would be really great to have you on, to have you talk a bit about it. There's been a lot of controversy on both sides. How do you see the bill shaping out? This was a key issue at the Republican gubernatorial debate on Saturday night. One of the candidates has been taking a lot of hits on it. I'm just interested in your thoughts, how you interpret how this proposed amendment would work.
So yes, what SJR 39 would do is submit to the voters of the state of Missouri, either in August or November, the chance to protect their fellow Missourians, churches, pastors, religious organizations, and a certain narrow class of individuals, specifically small business people in the wedding industry who provide goods of creative or artistic expression, people actually being asked to in a way participate in a same-sex wedding ceremony, from being penalized by government for their sincerely held religious beliefs about marriage. Now, where it is politically, on March 10th, after a historic 38-hour filibuster, the Missouri Senate, by a vote of 23-7, passed SJR 39 and sent it over to the House. It's now in the House Emerging Issues Committee where it awaits a vote. I anticipate that vote should happen shortly, and I'm hopeful that it will move on and eventually be passed by the full House.
In a court of law, how would someone prove that they have a sincere religious objection to same-sex marriage if they're a business? Because I could foresee a situation where a business person has no real religious affiliation but uses this as an excuse to deny services to same-sex couples if they don't like gay people, essentially. How would they be able to prove that in court?
Well, again, I think we need to be clear that this isn't a broad excuse to deny services to same-sex couples. And also, let's be clear that in the great majority of jurisdictions in this state, sexual orientation and gender identity are not protected classes, so that in most places in this state, the hypotheticals that some are warning about are perfectly legal and just aren't happening at all. But the burden of proof would be on the person seeking to assert the defense, and they would have to prove, for instance, that they had were the member of, say, a church that taught that marriage was between one man and one woman, and therefore that is why they were exerting that defense. But one thing to remember, Jason, is that in the cases around the country, whether in Oregon or Washington or elsewhere, in almost no cases was there actually a couple being denied service. What typically happened is the couple, let's call them Bob and Jason, went to the first florist and said, we're going to get married. Will you do our flowers? And the first florist said, sure, we will. What date and time? And they went to the second florist and were told the same. And same with the third and the fourth and the fifth. And they got to the 25th, who had objections to participating in a same-sex ceremony. And they said to that 25th florist, we'll see you in court. So really, we're not talking about denial of service. We're talking about creating a religious exemption, a religious protection against persecution based on one's sincerely held religious beliefs.
Now, as you're aware, the Missouri Chamber and some other business groups have been saying that they're concerned about economic backlash that you've seen in some other states, while in some cases the bills that were signed into law in those states weren't the same as what we're talking about here, but they're all seen as anti-LGBT, anti-gay rights. I know from what I understand, that's been what has been slowing the progress in the House. I'm just interested in your take on this and how effective has that argument been, whether it's right or wrong.
Well, yeah, Joe, I am very disappointed in the reaction of the chamber and some others in the business community, and I really don't like the characterization that businesses are against my bill, but I would say some of the corporate elites are against my bill. When my bill received its hearing in the Senate, not a single business group testified against my bill. The only testimony in opposition against SJR 39 in the Senate was the ACLU and Promo. But then after it passed the Senate, all these business groups came out of the woodwork. Now, I would point out that some of there was a list of businesses that allegedly opposed SJR 39, and one of the House members came to me yesterday and said that he called some of these members that allegedly signed on in opposition to SJR 39, and it turns out some of them had no idea that their name was being used and that indeed they were not opposing SJR 39. But I believe this talk about economic backlash is overblown. Houston repealed a gay rights ordinance in November, and there was talk about all the economic backlash that would happen, and Houston is doing just fine. Indiana, despite all the blow-up over their Religious Freedom Restoration Act bill last year, had its best economic year in history. Now, Indiana had a RFRA. My bill is not a RFRA, and it was carefully crafted to not be a RFRA. RFRAs are much more broad, and I could see why the LGBT community might be threatened by a broader law. So I think some of the economic concern is overblown, but I think and I would finally add that the one business group that did testify in the Senate hearing on my group was the business group representing the largest industry in the state of Missouri, the Missouri Farm Bureau that represents 100,000 members. They testified in favor of my bill. So I don't think that economic and religious liberty and economic prosperity need to be at odds, and I think that in the long run, protecting religious liberty is not only good for freedom, but is good for business.
So I wanted to play a clip now from one of your former House colleagues, Jeanette Mott Oxford, when you served in the House in, I think, 2006 to 2008. I think you served together.
Correct. She's
She's the executive director of Empower Missouri, and she's the first openly lesbian state legislator who has ever served in the Missouri House, I believe. And I thought that she made a pretty important point here that I want to play and then ask you about it.
certainly the focus for your wedding day is on your joy. Whether you're a same-sex couple or a male-female couple, you're wanting to have a wonderful day that celebrates your love, that invites your family and your friends in. So the idea of hiring some type of a business person to work with you on that day that's going to be a pouty killjoy, who's going to be there reluctantly and who's going to make a point of saying, I don't believe in people like you, it's just not what you want your wedding day to be like. There are a lot of businesses that would be glad to have same-sex couples work with them, and I think that the LGBT community, as other oppressed minority communities do, make it a business, make it their priority to spend their dollars with those that support their cause.
Now, I understand that there have been instances in other states where same-sex couples have sued businesses, as you mentioned. But I think that the point that former Representative Oxford is trying to make is this isn't a situation that occurs very widely, where a prospective couple goes into business, they're rejected, and then they sue. They would probably go to a business or gravitate toward a business that would want their business. And I think it brings up the question, if this really doesn't happen very often, does it really warrant amending Missouri's Constitution to prevent this hypothetical from occurring? What do you think of that contention?
Well, listening to the quote from Jeanette, I really do wish her Jeanette and her partner all the happiness and joy in the world. She after the hearing, she showed me pictures of her wedding album. And it was very touching. And Jeanette has become a friend over the years. And once in a while, Jeanette and I are on the same side of some issues politically. So honestly, Jeanette actually makes a case in favor of freedom of association. As she said, an LGBT couple generally is going to want a wedding vendors who do support, who do affirm the idea of same-sex marriage. And isn't that what our country and what our society is all about freedom and about pluralism? But it is an injustice when radical activists seek out people who disagree and then use the power of government to persecute them. And that is really what SJR 39 is about, because that is happening in other states. And should Missouri, say, enact a statewide law like MONA, the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act, it is something that could happen statewide in Missouri.
Now, what about in some states? I mean, forgetting whether the laws are right or wrong, but just looking at the economic impact from, while they didn't sue anybody, they're just saying our company's not going to expand here, or our company's not going to locate here. North Carolina is already running into that, where a couple major businesses that had been expected to locate there all of a sudden aren't. You've had some artists or musicians who've canceled concerts in North Carolina or elsewhere because of this. I mean, they're not suing anybody, but they're using their economic power. Is that fair for them to do that?
So Joe, good question, because you hear this asserted a lot. So, for instance, it is asserted that in Indiana, $60 million of convention business was lost. Now, where did that figure come from? That figure came from the number of convention schedulers who said, quote, "We're not going to come to your state because you are considering or you have passed a Religious Freedom Restoration Act." Now, that would be like me saying to the state of Massachusetts, because you have a Democrat governor, I'm not going to schedule a family vacation in Massachusetts.
They have a Republican
summer.
Governor, by the way.
Oh, I'm
now,
sorry.
but
You're right, Jason. Okay.
Continue.
Continue. The state of Illinois.
Okay.
In the state of Illinois, because you have a Republican governor.
They have a Republican governor too.
That's what I said. I changed my hypothetical. Because you have a Republican governor, I'm not going to vacation in Illinois next summer. I have no plans on vacationing in Illinois next summer anyway. So it's very easy for me to assert that to make a political point. So I think that 60 million is probably an illusory figure. But when you look at in Indiana, if you look at real job growth, real corporate relocations and expansions in 2016, and a number of tech companies piped in during the Indiana RIFRA debate, and yet tech jobs had a 150% increase in growth over the previous year. So Indiana has had a record year despite all the RIFRA blow up last year. And when you look at the real economic data, these political boycotts often don't work. And you got to remember, Arizona, for instance, has been under a boycott for a decade over their immigration law, and yet Arizona is doing just fine. So some corporate interests, some other non-governmental interests do make a lot of noise when there is a politically correct cause that a state runs afoul of. But in the long run, I think the effects of these boycotts are exaggerated.
One more question on this before we switch to another topic. Now, from my understanding from talking with a law professor from Washington University, the reason there was a lawsuit, for example, in Oregon over this is because Oregon has a statewide law that bans discrimination against LGBT individuals, similar to what you just said about Mona. And my question is, that was most likely enacted by a legislature elected by the people and signed into law by a governor that's elected by the people. So wasn't that situation in Oregon or any other state kind of a result of the legislative process going to fruition and the people's will, so to speak? And the fact that that hasn't happened in Missouri, but it may, if it does happen, it happened because, the people through their elected representatives wanted that result to occur. What do you make of that argumentation?
Well, a couple of points there. One is the answer to that question. That is part of the answer to why we are putting this in the Constitution as opposed to statute, because civil rights, civil liberties, including freedom of religion, have to be protected in the Constitution so that they are not subject to the whims and the will of the majority on any given day, on any given year. But I would say that even though Missouri does not have a statewide gay rights law, 14 municipalities or political subdivisions, counties and municipalities, do have these so-called SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity laws that can be used similarly to the Oregon or Washington laws, potentially to persecute those of religious belief. So yeah, this is necessary now, and it would be even more necessary. The other thing I would point out to those who do support Mona, because Mona is about a lot more than wedding vendors. Certainly, it's about employment and housing discrimination. If we passed SJR 39, it would be easier to get Mona passed because SJR 39 would provide a religious exception to Mona and therefore would make Mona less threatening. Now, there might still be other objections to Mona, such as creating a new protected class that could give rise to litigation. But really, the SJR 39 is about creating a religious exemption to some of these gay rights ordinances and statutes.
In the last 5 minutes that we have, we're going to do kind of a lightning round where
Sure.
I ask a question and Joe asks a question, then we'll let you get back to the Senate.
Right.
You've handled a lot of ethics-related bills,
Yes.
including a lobbyist gift ban
Right.
and a revolving door bill that passed through the House and then ran into a lot of opposition in the Senate to the point where these bills were changed pretty dramatically. My question is, were you surprised that these particular proposals ran into a lot of opposition from your fellow senators? And even if these, I guess the revolving door ban got winnowed down to 6 months, and the lobbyist gift ban is like $40 per instance as opposed to a total ban, are those really like results that are worth celebrating about? So kind of two-part question. Were you surprised by the opposition, and are you happy with the results?
Well, yeah, good question. First of all, yeah, I'm a little surprised about the opposition. I think that that ethics bills, in one sense, are a no-brainer. 35 states have some sort of a revolving door or prohibition on directly going from legislating to lobbying. Of 14 states that have term limits, 12 have cooling off periods where legislators have to sit out before they can become lobbyists. But I am, though, happy, Jason, with the outcome. So I myself filed a cooling off period or revolving door period bill that would have had a 2-year period. The House bill that came to the Senate had a 1-year period. It came out of the Senate with no period at all, but required that one serve out one's whole term, which if one resigned early in a Senate term could result in having to wait 3 or 4 years to lobby. We compromised at 6 months. So a senator would have to serve out his whole Senate term, a House member his whole House term, and then wait 6 months, which would be a whole legislative session before lobbying. So overall, I think it's not quite what I would have wanted, but I'm pretty happy with the result. I'm very happy we're sending that to the governor's desk. The other 2 things we're sending to the governor's desk are a prohibition on legislators acting as paid political consultants. I think the public, probably scratches their head at that one and says, legislators are actually doing that?
It's amazing. I just got to chime in. This was something that was talked about 8 years ago. I know that you're personally familiar with it because it became an issue in your congressional race, but I'm surprised it took 8 years for this to occur. I'm sure you're surprised as well.
I am too. As you know, in my case, it was someone who was I only felt comfortable with it because the person in question was on his way out of the legislature and was, pretty much a lame duck, and his time in the legislature was over. But when people pointed out, I said, yeah, this is an issue, and I learned from that. And yeah, 8 years later, it was not completely trouble-free to get across the line, but we did get it across the line, and I think it's a good piece of legislation. So overall, we got 3 good, and the third piece was the idea of legislators having to dissolve their campaign accounts when they become lobbyists. I think all 3 of those are good government ethics reform legislation. The process was not as smooth as I might have anticipated, but at the end, I think we got some very good bills done.
Okay, I have 2 questions. First, photo ID. Do you think it's going to come up in the final 3 weeks?
I think it will, Joe.
And do you think it'll pass?
I think it will.
So then, so our listeners will know that means it, like SJR 39, it would be put on the ballot, correct?
Yes, that's right. I think to do photo ID, it has to be put on the ballot, and it also requires enabling legislation passed by the legislature.
Now, you're an active Republican, and for our listeners, this weekend on Saturday will be the congressional caucuses in each of the 8 congressional districts in the state. That's where a large number of presidential delegates will be selected.
Yes.
And although Trump carried the state, there has been the Cruz camp has been successful in some other states of getting some of their people elected as Trump delegates who will then switch after the first ballot. I'm just curious in your take on what you think may be happening, because I figure that you're going to be involved in one of these on Saturday.
Sure. I think, there's a lot of misunderstanding about this process. And I was involved in the 2012 caucuses. I was a supporter of Rick Santorum, and then eventually became a Mitt Romney supporter. But in 2012, I was involved in caucuses in St. Charles County that the Ron Paul people came to and elected the majority of delegates. And what that meant is that those delegates ultimately, although they would be bound on the first round of balloting at the National Convention to vote for Rick Santorum, who won the Missouri primary, although that was a non-binding primary, so that's not a good example. Ultimately, if Mitt Romney had not received the majority of delegates, they would be unbound in subsequent rounds. Well, that's how it'll work this year. So the delegates elected at the congressional level on Saturday Saturday and then at the state convention who go to Cleveland will be bound to the winner of their congressional district or the winner statewide on the first round. That, in most cases, that is Donald Trump. I think Ted Cruz won a couple of congressional districts. And after that, if Donald Trump does not get 1,237 delegates, the rules are that subsequently delegates are unbound on subsequent ballots, and that's what we refer to as an open or contested convention.
Now, will you be running to be a delegate?
I will be.
For who?
So was elected as part of the Courageous Conservatives slate out of St. Charles County, and it was a coalition of various folks, but I personally endorsed Ted Cruz well over a month ago. I would say 2 months ago.
Yeah, and this will only be an issue if Donald Trump does not get all the delegates he needs on the first ballot, and if he does, it's a moot point. If he doesn't, we're going to have a lot of fun in Cleveland, including you potentially if you're chosen as a delegate.
So will you be a Trump delegate initially?
So on the first round, if I am chosen on Saturday to go to Cleveland on the first round, I'll be voting for Donald Trump. You got to remember Seward's folly. William Seward had the plurality of delegates going into, I believe it was the 1860 Republican presidential convention, and on the second ballot, he failed to get a majority, and on the third ballot, another candidate named Abraham Lincoln got a majority and went on to become our president. So Republicans have chosen their candidate in an open convention, I believe 6 times since then, and Democrats 2 or 3 times. So this, even though we haven't done it really in recent history, the closest was 76 when Gerald Ford went into the convention without a majority of delegates. It isn't unheard of, and the rules are pretty well established.
And just a parting thought before you head out. Actually, there was a Missourian who was involved in a very similar situation like this. In 1912, Champ Clark, who was the Speaker of the Missouri House, had a majority of delegates going into that convention. Unfortunately, the dastardly Woodrow Wilson managed to outflank him, even though he had a majority of delegates. And Champ Clark did not become president of the United States. So just to kind of buttress your point, it is not unheard of for somebody to come in with a convention with the majority of delegates and then not become the nominee on both parties.
There we go. We could have had President Seward and President Clark.
Yeah, and I'm sure that my good friends Ellie Glenn and Jay Scherter would have been thrilled that somebody from Pike County became president of the United States. But that's for another day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Jason. Great to be on with
you. You can listen to all our stories at stlpublicradio.org. I'm on Twitter at Jay Rosenbaum. You're on Twitter at
Jay Mannies. That's JMANNIES.
And you can be followed at Bob Onder Mo. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Thank you very much. Until next time, so long.
Came true for me.
The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer. St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on The Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.